So welcome to the first of our many webinar series with the Adaptation and Mitigation Nexus, AMNex. We're an NCA Net affinity group, and the National Climate Assessment has a network of networks, and I'll get into this in a little bit. But today we have a session on connecting the dots, and we're lucky enough to have Steve Winkelman with the Center for Clean Air Policy as our presenter today. He's the Director for Transportation Adaptation at CCAP. My name is Emily Seiler. I'll be the moderator today. I'm the Informed Decisions Program Manager here at U.S. Global Change Research Program. And just to give you a little bit of background on what we're going to go over today in the webinar, we'll do some brief introductions and an overview of AMNex, our Adaptation Mitigation Network Affinity Group, Nexus Affinity Group, apologies. Then we'll pass it over to Steve Winkelman so he can give his presentation on Adaptation Mitigation Synergies, connecting the dots. We'll have a good amount of time for Q&A and discussion. And then we're going to wrap it up and discuss future proposed webinars that we have down the line.
Just as far as logistics go, let me interrupt 1 second, Emily. I know that Steve's having a hard time hearing, but if folks can just let us know through the chat box if you can hear us okay, that would be great. But we're going to keep moving on.
Thanks, Shanna. So just a little bit about NCA Net. We're part of the National Climate Assessment, which is a mandate within the U.S. Global Change Research Program, is the development of a quadrennial national climate assessment known as the NCA to most folks. And NCA Net is a network of networks, and it has over 100 organizations, universities, federal agencies that participate. And the main purpose is to engage producers and users of assessment information across the United States and internationally. NCA Net has several affinity groups that are focused on different topics such as communication, engagement. They have ranging from different sectors, built infrastructure and the environment. Dick Rice here, who represents that affinity group. So AMNex is sort of a child of the NCA Net, and it really focuses on improving understanding of an integrated approach for implementing adaptation and mitigation strategies. Our main focus for this year, and we do understand that there are lots of different focus that we could work on, but our main focus for this year is going to be on urban resilience and urban areas. So with that in mind, we're hoping to put this group through actions to fund and implement integrative strategies on the ground. So really getting some work done and also providing guidance and information to people on how that could play out. We're also hoping to enhance the capacity to connect the dots, which Steve will go into in further detail, and implement integrated adaptation mitigation strategies. And lastly, and this is kind of a really neat opportunity, is to provide input to the ongoing sustained national climate assessment. So any sort of products or documents that this group develops can be sort of technical inputs into consideration for the next national climate assessment. So here's a sort of list of our many members of AMNex, and you can see it ranges between federal agencies, state and local governments, nonprofits, and university corporations. So we have a pretty good array of folks that do have interest in this area, and the Nexus have already started working in this sort of integrative approach, and we're really excited about this being kicked off. It got kicked off in November 2013, so we're a relatively new affinity group, but we've gained a lot of momentum and are excited about what's moving forward. So some key activities that AMNex is going to be back into is research and papers and guidance documents on the co-benefits of adaptation mitigation, sort of what that looks like. A lot of folks who are working, from my perspective, at the federal agencies who are new to adaptation and mitigation have either been doing it as silos separately, and we want to start getting them thinking about how to do it in a more integrated fashion. We're also working on a survey of the existing efforts, strategies, and research on the interface, along with a survey of case studies. And we'd really like to start gathering case studies on where this sort of integrative approach has been happening on the ground. We're having webinars. This is the first kickoff. We have several different ideas of webinars on either sectors or different areas of interest where the intersection meets. So at the end of this webinar, we'll go through some proposed future webinar topics. We have pilot studies that we'd like to kick off, and then the new Council for Preparedness and Resilience and the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force are just getting off the ground, and we'd really like to use their enthusiasm to gather recommendations either through them or through this AMNex affinity group, so that when they're implementing strategies on the ground, they can start thinking at an integrative approach. So we're going to start off with just 2 questions. And if you could identify and do a sort of a quick poll just to sort of let us know what your area of expertise is, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, adaptation and mitigation, or other. That would be really helpful. And we see that you all are participating, so we really appreciate that. We'll give it about 15 seconds or so. And then folks in the room here, if you could circle it, we're going to collect it afterwards. That would be great. So I think 72% of you have voted, and it looks like we have a lot of folks that are sort of in between adaptation only and then the interface. So that's great to see that we have the right people on the call and in the room. So we're going to close that one.
Just quickly sharing the results with everybody else, what it looks like.
So it's 43% for both adaptation and adaptation mitigation. So then we're going to go to,
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're going to go to the second question, and this one is regarding current or planned projects, programs, or activities that you have that talk to the adaptation mitigation interface. So you can answer either yes, currently working on it, yes, I have plans for it, or I'm not quite there yet. And thanks for being interactive with us. We really appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to close that and share the results. It looks like almost 50% of you are currently working on adaptation mitigation intersection projects, and 22% have plans to, so that's also really helpful to know. And one thing I did want to share before I turn it over to Steve to present, excuse me, is that we had over about 60 people who had registered for this, and we currently have 38 people on the phone, but we have representatives from across the U.S. and internationally. We have federal agencies such as U.S. Agency for International Development, Department of Transportation, university representation, University of Arizona, Rutgers. We also have folks from different cities around the U.S. and the world. We have folks from Boston, London, Washington, D.C., Toronto, and New York City. And we have several nonprofits and consulting firms also represented. So just to give you a little bit of sense of who also is on the phone and in the room. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve for his presentation, and take it away, Steve.
Thanks very much, Emily. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. The information age has arrived. Thanks, everyone, for joining us and taking the time for this. I'm really excited to see that about half of you are already working on this intersection. This really is as much a chance for us to share what we've discovered so far in this space, but to get some feedback and input from you all about what's already going on to see what we can do together. So I'm going to talk about work that research that primarily Shauna has done with me to look at some of these synergies and try to see how we can connect the dots, whether we are talking about starting with adaptation or starting from mitigation. How can we find these integrated opportunities? So I'll go over very brief background in adaptation and mitigation, focus the talk on examples of urban adaptation and mitigation synergies, and give some thought to how do we get to implementation and what kind of next steps we can take, and then go into the group discussion. Briefly, CCAP, Center for Clean Air Policy, we've been around for more than a quarter century, focusing primarily on greenhouse gas mitigation, these days primarily in developing countries, also in the U.S. We have our Mitigation Action Implementation Network working in countries, some of which you can see highlighted. I've been doing a lot of work in Colombia, lately in Mexico. We also work on adaptation. Two key themes of our work are public-private collaboration, because neither government nor business can do it on their own, and sustainable urban development with a real focus on land use. Our Weathering Climate Risks program, funded by the CERDNA Foundation, aims to catalyze implementation progress. We've been focusing to enhance community resilience. We've been focusing on Washington, D.C. for the last year or so. And we're also looking at how to measure climate resilience, not just physical impacts, but how do we measure implementation progress? How do we measure effectiveness? How does it affect people, infrastructure, and the economy? So that we can integrate climate planning with both policy and community priorities. Number of publications in this space, I'll note a couple. A report we did for NOAA on identifying information and assistance needs around transportation and climate adaptation. Really important to see what practitioners need to actually make progress. A report on Washington, D.C. on severe weather and critical infrastructure resilience. And a report I'll talk about a bit later on the economic benefits of smart growth called Growing Wealthier, which I think applies to the adaptation issue or resilience issue as well. But our key framing of this has been called Ask the Climate Question, a phrase coined by Jim Lopez and Ron Sims when they were both in King County before they both went to HUD and then came back to Washington State. Ask the climate question, because what we build, where and how we build it, makes a difference, both for greenhouse gas emissions and resilience or vulnerability to climate impact. So how will our investments, infrastructure, land use policy decisions affect mitigation or adaptation? And our urban leaders partners asked that climate question across departments and functions, and it led to a number of very interesting common sense solutions. So I encourage just the common sense. Ask the question, is this making it better or worse for emissions, for adaptation? I think that can bring us a long way. Or as Ron Sims put it, it's like breathing and eating. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt. And by the way, I'm not going to get into big definitions today. By mitigation, I mean reduce emissions. By adapt, I mean prepare for climate impacts. And we could spend a whole other call on terminology. In our colleague in the Philippines, Lucille Sering, the head of the Climate Change Commission there, says mitigation is part of our preparedness. So I think we're seeing, especially in developing countries, more of an integrated approach. The literature on this topic I find a little wanting. There's some great descriptions of trying to compare mitigation and adaptation, and they're important because there's different undertakings, and we need to acknowledge that. But one of the key things that has occurred to us in working in both spaces are some cultural differences. And by that I mean that typically folks working on mitigation tend to be policy people, economists, engineers, more and more planners. On the adaptation side, primarily scientists, planners, operations people. And so different skills required for different tasks, and so they may not necessarily communicate with each other, know how to communicate with each other. So are there opportunities to get out of the silos? And so, you know, we've used this Venn diagram a fair amount over the past years, and basically saying, what is the overlap between adaptation and mitigation? And here's the with an urban focus in this particular figure. Now, I've seen a number of these. The first time I saw it was in Toronto, and I think Carol Mead's on the call today from Toronto. So hey, Carol. Where typically you see this in a mitigation plan and says there are measures that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance adaptation, but that's not the focus of this report. Similarly on adaptation. And so that's fine. I get it. Your job from your mayor or governor or whatever was to prepare a mitigation plan or an adaptation plan. But the question is, aren't there synergies? And I always thought with the Venn diagram that the middle is the important part. But whose job is it to do that? So my question is, how important is that sweet spot in the middle? And I think that's what we're trying to do in AMNex. Are there significant opportunities? We know there are opportunities. Are they important? Are they just directionally correct? Again, I think the literature on this topic tends to be a bit general or theoretical, and what I think is needed now, what we're starting to do, is document more specific examples, and importantly, try to find implementation opportunities. Let's not just ask. Let's try to do this. But why? Just because I'm enticed by the middle of Venn diagram? No, because it's about money. Can we increase return on our investments? Can we increase the climate benefits from our infrastructure investments? Can we increase the returns on our mitigation and adaptation investments? First. Second, are there more revenue sources that we can bring to the problem? Nobody has enough money for adaptation or mitigation. If there are measures that can tap both pots of money, and I'll come back to this in developing countries, it's especially important, that's great. Are there infrastructure funds, disaster relief, as we're seeing now with FEMA post-Sandy, economic development? How can we tap multiple revenue sources to get at these results? And so there are also conflicts between adaptation and mitigation. And I'm not focusing on them today, but I have one slide because it's important to acknowledge them and keep them in mind. My question is not, are there potential synergies or potential conflicts? We know both exist. The focus of today is to try to find those synergies and see where they can be pursued. But let's talk about some of the conflicts that need to be avoided. First of all, the famous one. As it gets hotter, people are going to use more air conditioning. That's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions if we don't decarbonize the power grid. Surface water temperatures can decrease power plant efficiency because they don't cool them as effectively. Some technologies like some CSP solar can actually require more cooling water than a gas combined cycle turbine. And of course, sea level rise and severe storms can disrupt all power infrastructure, including low carbon power. Desalinization can increase energy use. So again, we want to try to identify these conflicts in advance and be aware of them. All right, so where is adaptation plus mitigation already underway? And I'm really interested in the half of you who said you're already working on this, or the other 20% who said you plan to. Federal agencies, through climate plans on both mitigation and adaptation, are starting to ask both parts of the climate question. Not necessarily in an integrated way, but some are. The tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the rebuild by design process we'll talk about a bit later, incorporating both. In Connecticut, looking at incorporating resilience into their pace, efficiency, and renewable efforts. In Boston, recent report on green and resilient buildings, as well as work on district energy systems. And in the District of Columbia, an intention to integrate adaptation and mitigation efforts. I'll talk about a pilot bike evacuation project a bit later in the presentation. And going to the other Columbia down in South America, where CCAP has been working for the past couple of years and helped secure a grant from Germany and the UK, $20 million for transit-oriented development. This is focused on pedestrian-oriented communities with good transit service, focused real estate, good public space, all that. We said, let's include adaptation criteria in that. So we're designing places that not just reduce emissions, but help prepare for heat and flooding. The Philippines has an Eco Towns initiative to integrate local renewables with adaptation. They've obviously suffered serious flooding and earthquakes in recent months. Micro hydropower similarly trying to reduce transmission needs, emissions, and also vulnerability to calamities. Copenhagen, there's a new report on climate resilient neighborhoods, and as one example. Germany, their development guidelines include basically asking the other part of the climate question. If you're funding adaptation, ask about potential mitigation opportunities. That's, I think it's been around for the last year or so. I haven't seen results from it yet, but it's out there and getting people to think about it, which is great. The Green Climate Fund, $100 billion pledged for both adaptation and mitigation. And at a CCAP policy lunch in Warsaw at the climate talks late last year, a number of developing countries said, when you're figuring out what mitigation measures to fund, see if they have adaptation benefits. They're already asking that other part of the climate question. And it's very exciting. As you know, internationally, it's a politically challenging issue because developing countries have major adaptation needs that they want to see funded. And a lot of Annex 1 countries have been focusing on how do we reduce emissions. If that sweet spot in the middle of the Venn diagram provides these A+M solutions, that could be helpful for tapping both pots of money and advancing not only implementation, but hopefully some of the politics here. Other examples, I think a lot of this stuff is going on with people who don't have adaptation nor mitigation in their vocabularies. And so we need to find those people, whether they're engineers or architects making efficient, strong buildings and aren't thinking about climate change. There's probably a lot out there that will be helpful. And if you have other examples, please let us know. Shauna's email is here. You'll see our contact information at the end. I'll come back to these are sort of my conclusions up front, but we got to ask both parts of the climate question. We need to follow the money as well as a political momentum. Where are we already spending money on infrastructure or climate change? What do stakeholders actually care about? What does the governor or mayor or your boss, what are their priorities? What are they spending money on? And we find for the private sector, as well as government, business continuity is huge. How do you keep the lights on? How do you make sure your employees can get to work? All that depends on energy resilience. And so there's important cross-sector interactions between energy and transportation, water, buildings that we'll talk about. But in many cases, that's what I found is most important for the private sector. That's what gets their attention. How do we stay in business? And so then how do we connect the dots, whether you're starting at M to A or A to M? We're doing a workshop and symposium in 2 weeks. If anyone's planning to come to the Building Climate Solutions Conference, I encourage you to join us. We're going to hear policy perspectives from Susan Rufo at CEQ, hear from Johnson Controls and from the building sector, also from Deborah Balin from the building sector, Emily Saylor from USGCRP on capacity building needs. We'll get perspectives from philanthropy, John Nordgren, Georgetown Climate Center, Jessica Granis. We'll hear about microgrids. We'll talk a bit more about today from Shalom Flank at Pareto Energy. Water from Lawrence Vandertak at CH2M Hill, and the lead climate change policy people in Boston, Brian Sweat, and Washington, D.C., Brendan Shane. This workshop, as you can see, all-star cast, really focused on not let's just talk about what are the interactions, what are the implementation opportunities. And when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm especially interested in hearing about how come you didn't mention this example, or we think there's a great chance to connect the dots here. So keep that in mind. All right, so how do we connect the dots? If you're setting new building codes, if you're in the Philippines and it's about earthquakes, or somewhere else and about fire or flooding, do you have energy and water efficiency included? If so, you have an integrated sustainable green building strategy. You're investing in transit-oriented development. Are you investing in green infrastructure? Are you making sure you're not building in the floodplain? If so, you can get to sustainable urban development. Are you investing in renewables? If so, are you making sure the grid is resilient for both the current climate as well as the future climate? And if so, you can get to resilient, sustainable energy. We developed this matrix, maybe poorly named so far, 3x3 A+M matrix, basically saying, what are your top 3 investments in adaptation, in mitigation and infrastructure. Very simply, look at your portfolio, look at your organization or your department's budget. What are you spending money on? And are there opportunities to connect the dots, to enhance the mitigation benefits of adaptation investments and vice versa, to enhance the climate benefits of infrastructure investments? So we populated this with some made-up examples, and we can refine it with some of the real-world examples we have in my presentation today. But I put this out here on purpose where you'll see that the adaptation and mitigation investments tend to be in the millions, in my made-up example, and the infrastructure investments tend to be in the billions. And so therefore, looking at how we're spending our infrastructure, where we're already spending money, where there's an opportunity to enhance those benefits becomes important. We can send you a copy of this matrix if you're interested in, and it's an experiment for us. My common sense is it's an effective exercise to look at where you're spending your money and seeing if there are some opportunities, whether synergies or conflicts, to be avoided, and I'm curious to see if it's a useful tool for you. We can think of synergies at all scales, from the building, to the community, to the city, and higher up. And opportunities, again, if you're making a siting or design or investment decision, anytime you're making a decision like that, there's a chance to look for opportunities. And so I'm going to go through the bulk of the rest of the presentation and give you some examples of measures in different sectors. Again, thanks to Shauna for preparing so much of this research and background for the presentation. All right, starting with the energy sector. So what do we do when the lights go off, as they did in 2012 after the Direct Show? I'll just do that again because it's fun. I don't know if there's a lag on the phone. So the lights go off. So, well, what can we do? What are the risks for the power sector? Most importantly, power outages cause business interruptions, which can cause $20 to $50 billion in annual losses. So that's important. There can be losses from flooding, damage from windstorms. Drought can limit cooling water for powering plants. Heat can disrupt the grid. We already talked about increased air conditioning demand. These are some of the risks. Union of Concerned Scientists has been doing great work in this space for some time. Talked about identified places where the water coming into a power plant is too warm, to properly cool it, or the outgoing water is too warm in terms of ecosystem impacts, or there's just not enough water, or projected not to be enough. Important way to this energy-water connection or collision is important to consider. Well, the solutions, again, I don't think there's going to be anything really surprising here. I think the surprising thing is how do we group these together? So energy efficiency, we know that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also helping prevent the grid from overloading. It can help maintain business continuity, enhancing that resilience. Microgrids, on-site renewables, CHP, which is combined heat and power, all these can reduce greenhouse gases, but again, enhance resilience at the building level, at the grid level, at the neighborhood level, and help businesses maintain operations and avoid interruptions. Of course, water use efficiency can reduce emissions, as well as help prepare for drought. And protecting equipment, again, will keep the lights on. And I talked about the energy sector being important for so many other sectors, whether it's transportation or buildings, or just keeping keeping America in business. Microgrids. This figure is courtesy of Pareto Energy. Shalom Flink over there shared this with me. And what I really like about it is that we're looking at the neighborhood scale of a group of buildings, and we're seeing a variety of solutions here. I realize it's probably hard to read on your screen, but energy efficiency, renewable energy, combined heat and power, and this integrated approach can certainly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but enhance good stability, reliability, reduce vulnerability to disruptions, and again, maintain business continuity. To me, that's a theme we keep coming back to. How do we stay in business? There are certainly technical and political and regulatory challenges to overcome, but a recent Navigant research study shows that this industry can quintuple in the next 7 years, up to $20 billion. So I think it's important to look at, but we need to look beyond the buildings, right? If we want to maximize adaptation and mitigation benefits, we need to look at the neighborhood scale. And someone once gave me a great analogy. If you're planning the Olympics, I don't wish that on my worst enemy. It sounds like a real challenge. But if you're planning the Olympics, London's on the phone, you've done this, it's not just about funding one stadium at a time. You have to build the whole Olympic Village, a group of buildings with a connective infrastructure that have to function together, that funders need to know that this is well managed, that there's a central place to put these investments in. And so when we're looking at microgrids and groups of buildings, we can get to that broader scale. We can achieve these greater resilience benefits, not just the resilience of a building, but the resilience of a neighborhood, if we think a little bit broader and think about implementing at a business improvement district or a corporate park, or with our colleagues, say, in the Philippines or Hawaii, at the island scale, where places is by definition disconnected. So hopefully we'll come back to this in discussion. We'll be talking about it at the workshop in 2 weeks. And by the way, anything here, keep in mind, if you'd like to hear a webinar on a topic, let us know. Each of these sectors and issues could obviously warrant their own more detailed discussion. And we've seen how these combined heat and power systems performed during Superstorm Sandy. Places like Princeton University, NYU, Co-op City kept the lights on because they had these resilient systems in place. So real-world performance. Mayor's Task Force in Washington, D.C. is interested in undergrounding power lines to enhance resilience, reduce outages from storms. An important measure to consider. I'll just mention, as I sort of rattle through this, DOE's report on climate resilient energy technologies is online, as will my slides after this. So I don't expect you to be able to read everything on any of these slides, but to basically hear a number of different examples to get the sense that there does seem to be a lot in the middle of the Venn diagram, and which of them seem most compelling. Switching to buildings. Again, very deep literature in this space, typically focused more at the building scale or the policy scale, so not necessarily the neighborhood scale like we just talked about, but very important studies from U.S. Green Building Council, New York City, Boston, IBHS, Johnson Controls. So a lot to work from. We just started putting together this little table on the sort of buildings energy nexus. Again, we've covered some of these, but I think it's worth sort of thinking about the multiple benefits. I won't read them all, but things like efficiency, which can, in addition to reduce emissions, enhance grid resilience and maintain business continuity. We already talked about on-site renewables and microgrids. Anything that's protecting or elevating mechanical and electrical systems, or protect structures, or protecting people, building infrastructure, maintaining business continuity. And we can do both at once. If we're talking about, efficiency, we'll talk about it more. But if you're sealing the envelope of the building, you can enhance efficiency, enhance resilience to storms. Anything on water efficiency can both reduce emissions and help prepare for declining supplies. And green infrastructure has multiple benefits, both in terms of reducing cooling needs, as well as mitigating heat and stormwater runoff. Johnson Controls has a nice framing of this out of their Institute for Building Efficiency, headed by Jennifer Lake. The new green buildings approach: grid responsive, resilient, efficient, energy positive, networked. They have a nice blog on that you can look up. We all know that green roofs can help reduce heating loads, air conditioning loads in buildings, as well as, if they're scaled up, help mitigate urban heat island and stormwater runoff. It's a great image from Chicago, thanks to Joyce Coffey some years ago. Here's an insurance company, I forget which one, in Lower Manhattan that flooded during Sandy. When Kelly Klima was at CCAP, she's now at Carnegie Mellon, she and I had a number of discussions with real estate developers, owners, tenants, to understand what they cared about. Again, business continuity comes to the top of the list. Employee access, energy resilience, supply and demand chains. We'll talk a little bit about the private sector later, but this is important because these are folks who have skin in the game. They own the real estate that's vulnerable. They're building the buildings. Important partners for the public sector when it comes to resilience planning. Switching to the water sector. The risks we know, the normal ones from climate change, flooding, landslides, storms, fire, drought. In this sector with impacts on water quality, from overflows, potential infrastructure damages, and of course, water shortages and increasing costs. A number of integrated solutions exist. Water efficiency and conservation we've talked about. Reuse of treated wastewater. We'll talk about some energy solutions, whether it's biogas or solar. Flood-proofing facilities. I call your attention to a report that just came out recently from the Johnson Foundation on building resilient utilities. Focus a bit more, I think, on the mitigation side, but importantly at these cross-sector interactions between water and electric utilities. My favorite example, I think Josh Foster's on the call, was when he was at CCAP and we were working in the Urban Leaders Initiative. We talked a lot about the Brightwater treatment plant in King County, where they saw projections for melting snowpack in the Cascade Mountains, therefore a need for other water sources in the future. And so while they were building the Brightwater sewage treatment plant, they said, let's go ahead and put in that purple pipe for distribution of reused water. And let's have the capacity in place so when it's time to treat that water, as they used to say, Don Tyler used to say, leave more water for the fish and people by reusing some of this water for industrial and agricultural purposes, build that in up front so we're prepared, even if it's 20 years in advance. And what's really interesting about that is the first example I know of where they actually spent more based on climate change impacts, an extra 2%, which is, of course, doesn't sound like much, but hard to raise that money up front, the political will to do it, but they did it. And at the same time, bringing in efficiency and renewables to the process. Clayton County, Georgia, constructed wetlands, both reduced energy use and cut treatment costs in half. The water utility in the East Bay is the first one to actually achieve energy neutrality, to produce more power than they use and be able to sell it back to the grid due to a combination of co-digestion, renewables, and efficiency. And closer to home for many of you, DC Water, probably just saw the article the other day, the first utility in North America to use thermohydrolysis for wastewater treatment. What does that mean? They're taking methane coming off the biodigester to generate heat and power, saving money and reducing emissions. At the same time, there are other benefits: reduced trucking, biosolids that can be used to fertilize trees and such, and just integrated with their efforts are a pure adaptation measure, a seawall, to prepare for a 500-year flood event for the Blue Plains treatment plant, which is a major facility in D.C. So here we're really seeing integrated solutions that are adaptation and mitigation, and also energy and water. And I think looking again at these cross-sector interactions allows us to look at multiple funding sources, or achieving multiple goals may allow for more revenue sources for implementation. Looking at urban development, again, my framing of sort of what we build, where and how comes into play. So how can land use planning reflect climate risks and prepare for expanding floodplains and more heat and storms? How to integrate that into transit-oriented development and strategically locate green infrastructure to deal with both heat and flooding. A lot of things that can happen on the building side, as we talked about, from efficiency to renewables to just mechanical and physical protection of the buildings, and then some green design approaches like low-impact development. Or you can really zoom out and say cities, if they're designed when run well, are very efficient. They're a desirable place for people to live from a mitigation perspective. And so they are a low-carbon solution that needs to be protected. Here's obviously a major long-term, major investment in protecting London, the Thames Barrier. But we can zoom in a bit at the community level or some regional studies. The Rebuild by Design initiative coming out of the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, led by HUD with many other partners, looking at a design competition, as many of you know, to address both structural and environmental vulnerabilities and develop fundable solutions that can help prepare for climate events. 10 designs have been selected, such as the Nassau County South Shore resilience building options called Living with the Bay. Another extreme example, this is coming from after the tsunami in Japan, a village that needed to be both to retreat and relocate, but since they had to rebuild, incorporating resilience, efficiency, and renewables. While doing that, a lot of work in the green infrastructure space, which I think it's important to point out. The green infrastructure can be helpful for a severe rain event. Remember that New York City subway example. If you're talking about a few inches of water, elevating the subway entrances or adding green infrastructure, that can be quite helpful. If we're talking about a few feet or a few meters from a storm surge, for example, then there's obviously other solutions that are needed. But green infrastructure also has multiple benefits, as we talked about. So American Rivers and the Center for Neighborhood Technology have called for a green infrastructure portfolio standard, the way we have renewable portfolio standards on the power side. Georgetown has talked about it, Georgetown Climate Center, as being two sides of the same coin. You can get both heat benefits and flood mitigation benefits. And Philly's well-known study on the triple bottom line benefits from their green infrastructure approach. And of course, there's ecosystem services valued at more than $20 billion per year in the U.S., so protecting natural infrastructure becomes quite important as well, and it's part of how I think about green infrastructure. All right, so what do we do on the transportation side when the systems flood, as we see here in New York, New Jersey, Colorado, or extreme heat strikes, melting runways, or buckling rails? Well, again, a variety of solutions. First, how do we protect low-carbon transportation? You can give some examples coming forward about pedestrian transit and cycling. How do we improve efficiency and ease evacuation? If you think of New Orleans, how do you get out, before the hurricane or after? Having network redundancy, having multiple modes can not only reduce emissions because you have low carbon modes, but also enhance resilience. So here's an example from New York City, subway flooding after 2007. You can see at the top where the water is coming in here that's the ventilation grates, right? More than 100-year-old system. Ventilation is just a hole in the ceiling, which means that if you have a major storm, I think this was about 2.5, 3 inches of rain per hour, you get flooding. But they came up with an interesting solution, and that is not just elevate, not just put a lip around that ventilation shaft and subway entrances, so that just, again, here a few inches, I referred to the slide, I realize I haven't showed it yet, a few inches of elevation can prevent that ventilation grate from being a drain, right, for the whole city. Water will come in through the grate, but not from all around. And of course, they've done it in a way that I think is beautiful, with a nice bench for pedestrians and a nice bike rack for cyclists. That's also, so you're dealing with protecting this low carbon mode in a way that advances resilience as well. Importantly also, part of this study after the 2007 flooding, they realized that a preemptive shutdown of the subway system would be appropriate in advance of a storm. And Hurricane Irene was the first time they did that. Hurricane Irene wasn't a hit like Sandy was for New York City in terms of the damage and in terms of direct hit, but when Sandy came, not only was MTA prepared to shut down the system in advance, but to let people know, and people have come to expect that they can make other plans so they weren't stranded in the system. So seeing both mechanical design and operational solutions. I talked about network redundancy. One example here is in Washington, D.C. Director of Planning Harriet Tregoning is working on a pilot where to have a fleet of bicycles that could be available in downtown areas for evacuation during a metro outage or other issues when there's an earthquake, minor earthquake in D.C. Last year or so, a number of my colleagues hopped on the Capitol bike share to get out of town when the metro wasn't available, or one person had their car stuck in the parking garage and couldn't get in. So having these redundancies are important, again, both for mitigation and adaptation. I like the infrared photos, but showing how even a little bit of trees a little bit of tree cover can help reduce the temperature for pedestrian environments and make that mode more comfortable. Compelling example about evacuation, let's say before a hurricane. Here's a photo of Houston before Hurricane Rita, nightmarish traffic coming out of the city, versus a library at Florida International University that was fortified to be able to withstand hurricane winds, and so that the college students wouldn't need to get on the road, be in that traffic, be part of that problem, generating more emissions. Instead, could hang out, spend the night, have plenty of food or beer or whatever they needed in the library. Some of you have heard me before will have heard this example of Toronto, where a severe storm knocked down branches that fell into the creek, that clogged a culvert, that blew out a road. And now Toronto has a checklist to basically say, we're going to inspect our culverts. It's no longer enough to design, build, and leave them. Now with more frequent storms, we need to inspect them. And now with a checklist and a flashlight, can actually save millions of dollars. And when it's time to rebuild, they can be rebuilt bigger and better to plan for new storms. I think there's something like 400 or so culverts in Toronto. Private sector, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but C2AS and Oxfam have done some important work in this space, and a lot of their concerns that I talked about before have to do with business interruption. And the flooding in Thailand a couple of years ago is an important example at the global scale to think about. First of all, $15 to $20 billion in losses, 800 deaths, and it disrupted the global supply chain for automotive and electronics, with thousands of factories closing and hundreds of thousands of workers displaced. When we talk to our colleagues in the insurance industry, the supply chain disruptions are some of the issues they're most concerned about from a business perspective. Wall Street being down for a day or so is a concern, but these sort of major structural impacts are a big deal. And so solutions range from insurance to reinsurance to relocation out of the floodplains. You see some of these areas. I think Bangkok has lost a lot of businesses who move sort of somewhere else. So it behooves all of us, whatever scale we're at, to be able to try to plan ahead to maintain again the business presence in our communities. And again, this energy efficiency issue keeps coming up as important for energy resilience and some independence from the grid or backup power when needed. I won't spend a lot of time on the economic assessment of adaptation and mitigation measures, except to say that often the analysis is narrowly defined. So we're not capturing things like ecosystem benefits, like some of the benefits of green infrastructure, like we've seen in Philly. But importantly, I think, as we did, Chuck Kujan and I did in our book, Growing Wealthier, to look at this from a multiple stakeholders perspective and say, what are the returns on investments or savings or quality of life impacts for different stakeholders, for businesses, households, cities, national governments? Because while the economists may want one number, what's the cost benefit on this? Political economy is made by basically stakeholders finding their cell and saying, this cell speaks to my self-interest. And if we can identify enough champions and enough winners, then these are the people who can get involved in advancing the solution. We all know we tend to play a lot more cleaning up for disaster as opposed to planning ahead. Great number from New York City. Not great in terms of the losses, $19 billion for New York City from Sandy, but the Plan YC plan over time, $20 billion for preventative measures. And so we can imagine that becomes a pretty quick payback if and when the next event comes. As climate scientist Ben Franklin always said, a stitch in time saves 9. This is starting to be supported by the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council. Says you invest in hazard mitigation, you can save $4. The Asian Development Bank says found a 5-to-1 benefit-cost ratio for coastal adaptation, and I expect as we take into account these other benefits, business continuity, ecosystem resilience, that Ben will prove to be right or perhaps conservative, that a stitch in time saves 9. So as I wrap up here, again, we want to ask both parts of the climate question. Remember, why are we doing this? Not because it's, but because we can increase return on investments and identify new revenue sources. We got to follow the money and the political momentum. Where are we already putting our efforts and energy and investments, and ask that 3x3 question to see where there are opportunities to connect the dots between mitigation and adaptation. And so, again, I encourage you to look at your portfolios, look at your budgets. Where do you have investments or policies, siting decisions, where there are opportunities to connect the dots and enhance your adaptation and mitigation benefits? Again, we're happy to send you this matrix. You can look at your top 3 investments and see if that brings to mind opportunities for improving the climate returns on your investments. And as just coming back to what Emily talked about, you've seen some of our survey questions. You'll see a couple more of them coming up. We plan to distribute that more broadly. We're focusing in on identifying implementation pilots using the 3x3 matrix, and at our Building Climate Solution sessions in a couple of weeks, looking at capacity building, research, data needs, and crafting policy recommendations for things, looking at, so much to build upon here, right? President's Climate Action Plan, the Council on Resilience, the state and local task force on preparedness, all sorts of policies and measures out there that I think provide good opportunities for connecting the dots, for improving to support implementation. Again, commercial for our upcoming workshop in 2 weeks. Hope you can join us, and I will turn it back to Emily. Thank you for your time and for attending this webinar, and really look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. So before we go into questions and discussion, we wanted to do 2 more polling questions. Question number 3 is,
it's 3, sorry.
Okay, so we're going to do question 3. Hold on one second. Actually, we'll start with question 4. So, whoa.
You can just read it here.
Okay. So this is associated with question 4. Then.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So we'll just go to 4. There we go. Okay. So what kind of capacity building or technical assistance would be more helpful to implement an adaptation and mitigation project? Would a cost-benefit analysis be helpful for mitigation and adaptation strategies versus, what you're investing in already? Observational capabilities, vulnerability assessments, indicators of successful resilience. When we talk about resilience, a lot of people have different views on what success means. So, helping figure out what that means for that capacity, or access to data, information, and tools. So it looks like cost-benefit analysis is pretty popular. And it'd be interesting to see if anyone is working on this, working on a cost-benefit analysis for a client or for an organization. So we're going to share those polling results. So 90% said cost-benefit analysis would be useful. That's really interesting. And next was indicators of successful resilience. Great, thank you for that. Then we'll go back to question 3, and that was, which sector do you think holds the biggest opportunities for adaptation and mitigation strategies or synergies? So your options are the building sector, energy, water, transportation, urban planning. If you don't see one on here that you think is an option, in the question sections we can talk about those. For instance, human health I think has a lot of opportunity to both cut carbon pollution and improve resilience.
pretty important.
Which one did you pick?
I love them all. So, you can't get along without water. Look at what West Virginia's been doing. You like being without energy?
And we also are, and Dick, that brings up a good point in that there are nexus within the nexus. So there's water, land, energy, and so trying to think of those sectors, as an integrated system is also really critical.
Here's where the urban planning integrates the system. But the urban planning changes and benefits are much longer range than with the others.
Exactly.
You've got to do it, but the effects won't be felt as quickly.
So folks felt as though building sector and urban planning were pretty critical opportunities for A&M strategies. So thank you for participating in our polls. It's really helpful. And before we get to Q&A, we just wanted to tee up the fact that we'll be trying to have these webinars on a monthly basis. We're going to focus on different sectors. And while we're focusing on one sector, we're not completely ignoring the others. So when we do talk about building sector, we will probably talk about water, energy, how those impact the building sectors. But if you have any interest in or expertise in these different sectors and want to either participate or host, let us know. Please reach out to Shauna, and we're going to talk about with our AMNex group in a little bit, sort of planning for these. But our ideal situation is that after each of the webinars, we'll develop a 1 to 2 pager that sort of gives an overview of what was discussed and some strategies, so that will lead into sort of a guidebook for future decision makers, so they can have a good sense of what the expertise and experts on the panels had provided. So with that said, we'd like to switch to Q&A. And since we have quite a number of people on the phone, if you do have a question, please send us a note in the chat box, or raise your hand. I'm not sure how to do that, but or folks in the room, if you have any questions for Steve or.
Yeah, so please speak up either by raising your hand or through the chat box. We'll try to do both, and we can also let you know if it's not working for some reason. But yeah, we've got folks in the room as well. Dick, go ahead.
This is Dick Wright, representing the American Society of Civil Engineers. A couple of points I want to make, and I think they relate well to what Steve was saying. You're going to find that the engineering community is very much aware of its need to contribute to both mitigation and adaptation. One thing I think this effort can do that's very important is to get the general public and the people who own infrastructure facilities and the people who finance and insure them to recognize the importance of life cycle performance and to be more comfortable about this 2% initial increase in cost that can give you great benefits over the service life of the facility. This is something we really need to do. I think you'll find the engineering community is fairly well prepared to respond, but it really needs to sell it to the clients.
So part of that is a lot of it is education and communication to folks that aren't as familiar or do have good investments in these areas. It's a great point.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any hands raised or anything in the chat box, but as we said, we're going to post Steve's presentation with a link with a recording to the webinar. So anybody in the room want to add any?
A couple of questions that came in on the chat, Shauna.
Oh, great. I'm not seeing them. I'm sorry.
Is it questions there?
Oh.
There we are.
A question, yeah.
Juliet Daniel said, I'd be interested to have future discussions on integrating adaptation mitigation and wider building retrofit, aligning with existing refurbishment goals. We've been doing some work on this in London with specific focus on social housing. That's great. I've no comment on that except that's great, and please, send us a link, Juliet, to what that work is. Always great to have other examples. I don't know if Sean or Emily, you want to respond to that.
I don't think we have anything else to add, but we would love different examples. And a part of what we're trying to do with AMNex, as I mentioned earlier, is collect either successful case studies or case studies that didn't work so well. We do learn a lot from our failures, and it's really valuable to share those stories. So if you have either best practices or not so best practices that you'd like us to not recreate, please send them our way, and we're going to start collecting those so that we can share those with the broader community as well.
I'm curious about that. What is there a plan or not about?
Your name and
oh, pardon me. This is Ashley Hazel from Blue Green Alliance. I just wanted to follow up. Is there a plan or ideas as to how those are going to be shared, or like what the portal is for sharing stories?
We haven't gotten that far yet,
Sure.
but ideally we would like to either post them somewhere on some sort of interface, but it would also probably be beneficial to have it as an input to the National Climate Assessment as sort of useful case studies on how to integrate both adaptation and mitigation.
I mean, is there a way to get it to like the state and local task force? I mean, from my perspective, as Christopher Lindsay with IAMO, I mean, the real, key, to all this information that we've been gathering or addressing, this nexus issue is to get into the hands of the implementers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have the state and local level. So is there a channel there where, you can put in, some of these recommendations that, as we do these various webinars coming up and come up with a two-pager kind of highlighting, here are some recommendations for that sector as well as case studies. Is there a way to feed that, to that group?
I'm sure we could find some way to share it with them, if not brief them on it. We still haven't figured out how exactly we're going to interact with them because they're so new and they have so many other sort of focus areas. But I know that there is interest from folks on the task force and the council on looking at the intersection of adaptation and mitigation.
And if we could just go around the room quickly and let folks on the phone know who's here, that would be great. So as you know, this is Shauna Udvardy with the Center for Clean Air Policy.
I'm Dick Wright with the American Society of Civil Engineers.
This is Bryce Golden-Chen with the National Climate Assessment.
This is Ilya Fischoff, also with the National Climate Assessment.
Katie Miller with GSA.
Christopher Lindsay with IAMO.
Ashley Hazel with Blue Green Alliance.
Great, thank you. And so, Emily, I'm not seeing any more questions. I don't actually, let's just double check. No more questions as far as in the question box.
There's one more came up from Julie Sakara. Has anyone experienced challenges with rooftop solar photovoltaics being damaged by typhoons or other extreme storms? We're considering linking, whoops, just scrolled up because a new question came in. We are considering linking rooftop solar to resilience measures such as microgrids, and a concern that rooftop PVs could be vulnerable to severe weather events. I don't have experience with that. Anyone on the in the room or on the chat have any experience with that?
This is Dick Wright. The defense against extreme winds of rooftop solar is just like defending the roof itself and anything else that's up there. So what you want is to give serious attention to the problem of extreme winds and be sure that the rooftop solar wasn't put there as an afterthought and it's just laying there and waiting to be blown away. It's going to take the same kind of attention that the roof itself takes.
Thanks, Dick. That's really helpful.
And I love when just common sense. I mean, Dick, you're always a great source for that. But when the answer is common sense, acknowledge the risk and then say, okay, we need that. But thanks for the question, Julie.
Yeah, back in the 70s, we had some interesting problems with rooftop solar when it set the building afire because it got hot enough to set the wood underneath it burning.
Make them the technology's improved.
Yep.
We have a comment from Jennifer DeMoy. She says, for future presentations, it would be great to have examples from the private sector She says that many businesses and industry sectors use risk management approaches to achieve both mitigation and adaptation benefits, including reducing energy costs, avoiding costs of climate impacts, and reducing vulnerability to business interruptions, et cetera. So that's great. Thank you.
Jennifer, if you have any examples of where this is happening in the private sector and can send them to us or send us, points of contact or introduce us to folks, we would really appreciate that.
I just want to make this is Ashley again from Blue Green Alliance, and not to answer the specific question about examples, but to highlight that Ceres hosted an investor forum today on climate change in the UN. And I believe the webinar or the webcast will be available. It looked very interesting. I watched the beginning of it, so that might be one to kind of watch and see what they had to say, because the business community is obviously extremely interested in a lot of these issues.
And insurance. So that's CER, yeah.
Yeah.
Ceres, okay.
Yeah.
One thing that occurs to me, thanks for that comment, Ashley, is look how active this space is. For those of us who've been doing adaptation for the last 6 years or 10 or whatever, there's so much going on at once is encouraging. And maybe one way, I always hesitate to sort of do a new group, but maybe we should do an AMNex sort of LinkedIn group as a central space to sort of share this presentation and some of these findings and put some of these questions out there. For example, I'm not sure if she's still on, but Jameson Rogers from the Next Generation that's doing the Risky Business project that I think many of us are excited to see the report come out at that, working with the private sector around especially adaptation and resilience. So I think there be good examples there as well as from Ceres, and that could be a LinkedIn group could be an efficient way to share some of this.
This is Dick Wright again. I think we're going to be able to share our case studies from our own website. I know certainly the American Society of Civil Engineers maintains case studies for its members, and to share the links with you, you'll begin to see some good cases of adaptation and mitigation show up in these case studies. And the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure is giving awards for the sustainability, and these deal with both adaptation and mitigation. So again, those examples will be quite relevant to what this group is doing.
Mm-hmm. Also,
I'll send you the links.
That would be great. Thanks, Dick. The U.S. Global Change Research Program is currently working on a global change information system, and their first phase of it is going to be sort of getting all the data and information behind the National Climate Assessment available and accessible to folks whoever wants it, so that they can use it for implementation projects or making decisions. And part of that, there's going to be a demonstration project on adaptation, and so we could sort of try to link to those case studies on that page as well. We just have to figure out how best to do that. But there are a lot of different options that I think we can work with. So do we have any other questions, folks in the room, or? Okay. Steve, did you want to say any closing remarks, or?
I think just it's exciting. I feel like we're on the verge of something really important, and it's going to take us a little while to figure out how important it is. Seeing the diversity of folks on the call and hearing, for example, when just some of the organizations that Dick mentioned, that those organizations aren't in my silos, and I think a lot of the sort of the connecting of silos to understand where some of these examples already exist is part of our work at AMNex and part of what we look forward to sharing. So please, we welcome your input and feedback. Appreciate your time today. You have all of our email addresses there if you have other questions, ideas especially of other examples that we missed of existing A+M efforts and things you'd like to hear about in the future. Please stay in touch. Thanks, Steve. And if you're not already a member of AMNex and would like to join or even join the NCA network, the NCA net, send me, Emily Seiler, an email, and we can get you connected. We're really trying to get people to work together on this area.
and identify areas of collaboration. So it's open to organizations that are already doing work in this area or are interested in doing sort of the intersection of adaptation and mitigation. So shoot me an email, send any case studies or information to Shauna. If you have questions for Steve, feel free to contact him directly. But thank you for your time, and again, we'll have some upcoming webinars, so look out for emails from us. We'll send out the presentation, Steve's presentation, make that available to folks, and again, thank you for your time.